To begin this video, I'm going to show you two different photographs. The first is from the 30th of June 1960, taken during the ceremony of the proclamation of the Congo's independence. From the late 1950s, Africa was swept up in a wave of decolonisation, and Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of an independent Congo, looked confidently to the future. To the crowd of dignitaries and citizens in the audience, he urged the people of the Congo to commence together a new struggle, a sublime struggle that will lead our country to peace, prosperity and greatness. We shall show the world what the black man can do when working in liberty, and we shall make the Congo the pride of Africa. The future was bright for the Congo. The largest country in sub-Saharan Africa, the Congo was home to immense natural resources. Its favourable climate had the potential for enough agricultural production to feed the entirety of Africa. Its vast mineral deposits, such as the Shinkwalobe mine which provided the uranium for the Manhattan Project, promised massive amounts of wealth. And the Congo River alone had more hydroelectric potential than every river and stream in North America combined, enough to power all of Africa. Both economically and politically, the independence of the Congo presented a massive opportunity for the millions of Africans throwing off colonialism and grasping at liberty, and Patrice Lumumba, a staunch Pan-Africanist and socialist, saw the Congo's independence as a decisive step towards the liberation of the whole African continent. The second picture is from less than 6 months later, taken in December 1960 as Lumumba was transported to an impromptu prison in Thouisville. During his time in power, Lumumba had faced a secessionist movement in the southern region of Katanga, a UN intervention of questionable motives, had narrowly avoided an attempted dismissal of his government by President Kasavubu, and had been arrested following a Belgian and American-backed military coup by General Mobutu. Unsure of how long he had left to live, Lumumba managed to smuggle a letter to his wife. In it, he wrote that the Belgian colonialists and their Western allies, as well as some of our compatriots, have done everything to distort the truth and smear our independence. Within days, Lumumba was killed, transported to his executioners in Katanga following plotting by the Belgian government and the quiescence of the UN. But how did this happen? How did the Congo go so quickly from a country of such promise to one of such disappointment? What enduring influence did colonialism have on these events? And what does this tell us about colonialism in Africa, and whether that colonialism really ended when these countries became independent? In this video, I will hopefully answer all of these questions. I've already done another video on my channel discussing what colonialism in the Congo looked like. It's not 100% necessary to watch to understand this video, but it does provide a bit more context. I'll put the link here and provide a quick version anyway. Colonialism in the Belgian Congo was bad. Even by the incredibly low standards of the time, Belgian practices were particularly brutal and exploitative. Under Leopold II, the Belgian king who had established the first colonial government in the Congo, the region was effectively run as a slave state, with workers coerced into awful conditions on the threat of death for them and their families. This included the common practice of cutting off hands of workers and their families if they did not meet the rubber or ivory quotas. Even after Leopold II, the region was still systemically underdeveloped, with the vast majority of wealth produced in the Congo going to enrich the people in Europe and North America. Very little returned to provide basic education services to the Congolese people. Through the use of unequal treaties, swathes of the Congo's most valuable land and resources were owned by European companies, and due to the lack of education services, by 1960, out of the 15 million Congolese who lived in the state, the number who had a university education was less than 30. In part, this was intentional. The less educated Africans in the Congo there were, the less likely they were to start questioning Belgian exploitation of the region. The foundations laid by Belgian colonialism could scarcely have been worse. As the 20th century drew on, it became clear that colonial governments in Africa, despite the desires of the colonisers, could not last forever. The creation of mandates out of the former German colonies in Africa following the First World War changed the discourses around colonialism, recontextualising it as a form of trusteeship where Europeans would prepare Africans for modernity and independence. Europeans imagined this point to be so far off in the future that it didn't bear thinking about. When Belgian professor A. van Bilsen wrote in 1956 that plans should be made for a federal union between Belgium and the Congo in 30 years, he was met with stunned reactions. 30 years? Why so soon? Africans, however, had different ideas. In the Congo, one such man was Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was born on the 2nd of July 1925 in Honolua, a village in the Katakokombe region of the Kasai province. He was a member of the Tetele people, a small ethnic group in the state. After a short education, he went on to a government post office training school, passing with distinction and working a variety of different jobs, such as a travelling beer salesman in Leopoldville and a postal clerk in Stanleyville. It was in these cities that he became increasingly involved in politics. Mingling with other évolués, the term used for educated or westernised Africans in French and Belgian Africa, he became part of the Belgian Liberal Party and became regional leader in the Postal Union, using his position and considerable charisma to promote anti-colonialism. From this platform, Patrice Lumumba helped create, and later become leader of, the Mouvement National Congolais, or MNC, in 1958. While this wasn't the first political party in the Congo, it differed from the others in one important area. The MNC was multi-ethnic. While parties like ABACO, formed in 1955, sought to primarily promote Bakongo interests, the MNC was the first major multi-ethnic party in the country, seeking to represent all the people and promote a unified Congolese national identity. While the MNC initially supported the same gradualist ideology of the Belgian government, they soon became swept up in the growing anti-colonial fervour of the 1950s. Increasingly radicalised by affairs inside and outside the Congo, including the 1958 All-African People's Conference in Ghana and ratcheting protests in major Congolese cities like Leopoldville, they soon began pushing for independence not in 30 years, but independence now. And fearing an Algerian war in the Congo, the Belgians acquiesced. In December 1959, the Belgian government promised independence within a year. The Congo was to be free. That is, free on certain terms. Even though the Congo was set to gain its political independence, its economic independence was still contested. As mentioned earlier, the Congo was home to a number of important products, notably minerals by the mid-20th century, which were incredibly valuable. And due to colonisation, the mines and infrastructure that enabled this production were owned by Belgian and Western companies. The Société Générale de Belgique, Belgium's most powerful financial group, and its affiliates such as the Union Minière de Haut-Katanga, controlled approximately 70% of the Congolese national economy. This included
Shinkolobwe. There's a name I haven't heard in a while. The U.S. bought a lot of uranium from Shinkolobwe mine during World War II for the Manhattan Project. They even sent a squad from the Army Corps of Engineers to reopen the mine after it was flooded. That's how good its uranium must have been. With that, the world's first nuclear test was a success. Shinkolobwe uranium might have been used in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs too. Just hearing its name is like seeing all the phantoms of the war rise up to haunt us.
Not only did these mines make a hell of a lot of money, but with the onset of the Cold War, America and its NATO allies wanted to ensure that these mines remained part of their sphere and didn't fall into the hands of the Soviets. For both economic and security concerns, Western governments wanted to ensure the economic status quo remained. To do this, the Belgian government strategically placed Belgian colonial administrators in important positions within the Congolese state. For example, the 25,000-strong Congolese army was headed by 1,000 Belgian officers. Of the 5,000 management-level positions in the civil service just before independence, only 3 were filled by Africans. Due to the poor quality of higher-level education in the Congo, there were few trained Congolese who could challenge for these roles, further cementing Belgian control. So even though independence was on the horizon, it still seemed as if Belgian and Western interests would have control over the state. This was a common tactic attempted by former colonial governments across Africa during decolonisation. But Africans across the continent were wise to this tactic. With increasing volume, they began to argue that political independence without economic independence was simply a continuation of colonialism, a neo-colonialism which perpetuated unequal relationships and exploitation. Perhaps the most prominent voice making these arguments was the first president of Ghana, and increasingly Lumumba's intellectual inspiration, Kwame Nkrumah. In his 1965 book Neo-colonialism, both reflecting on Western actions in Ghana and the Congo and prophesying what would happen in much of the rest of Africa, Nkrumah wrote, "The essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from outside." In order to prevent social conflicts in capitalist countries, Nkrumah argued, colonial and neo-colonial countries are underdeveloped. Their wealth utilised to benefit the colonists and the capitalist system. While this control is usually exercised through economic or monetary means, such as the IMF, in extreme cases it would be done through the imposition of troops. In 1966, Nkrumah himself was ousted as president of Ghana in a pro-Western coup d'etat. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Lumumba increasingly echoed these sentiments. On the 30th of June 1960, the day of the Congo's independence, a ceremony was held involving a number of Congolese and Belgian politicians and dignitaries, including Patrice Lumumba and King Baudouin of Belgium. The Belgian delegation had expected this to be a friendly affair, with lots of smiles and handshaking and Congolese thanking the Belgians for the bloody good job they'd done colonising them. King Baudouin, in his speech, celebrated that the independence of the Congo is the result of the undertaking conceived by the genius of King Leopold II. He later added, "Don't compromise the future with hasty reforms, and don't replace the structures that Belgium handed to you until you are sure you can do better." In a very patronising way, Baudouin was telling the people of the Congo not to change anything after independence. But after 80 years of colonialism, Lumumba had other ideas. Although this independence of the Congo is being proclaimed today by agreement with Belgium, an amicable country with which we are on equal terms, no Congolese will ever forget that the independence was won in struggle, a persevering and inspired struggle carried on from day to day, a struggle in which we were undaunted by privation or suffering and stinted neither strength nor blood. It was filled with tears, fire and blood. We are deeply proud of our struggle because it was just and noble and indispensable in putting an end to the humiliating bondage forced upon us. That was our lot for 80 years of colonial rule, and our wounds are too fresh and much too painful to be forgotten. After speaking about the abuses conducted by the Belgian colonial regime, Lumumba went on to set out his vision for a post-colonial Congo. Brothers, let us commence together a new struggle, a sublime struggle that will lead our country to peace, prosperity and greatness. Together we shall establish social justice and ensure for every man a fair remuneration for his labour. We shall show the world what the black man can do when working in liberty, and we shall make the Congo the pride of Africa. We shall see to it that the lands of our native country truly benefit its children. We shall revise all old laws and make them into new ones that will be just and noble. We shall stop the persecution of free thought. We shall see to it that all citizens enjoy to the fullest extent the basic freedoms provided for by the Declaration of Human Rights. We shall eradicate all discrimination, whatever its origin, and we shall ensure for everyone a station in life befitting his human dignity and worthy of his labour and his loyalty to his country. And we shall institute in this country a peace resting not on guns and bayonets but on concord and goodwill. In his closing words, he resolutely stated that the Congo's independence is a decisive step towards the liberation of the whole of the African continent. Our government, a government of national and popular unity, will serve its country. I call on all Congolese citizens, men, women and children, to set themselves resolutely to the task of creating a national economy and ensuring our economic independence. Eternal glory to the fighters for national liberation. Long live independence and African unity. Long live the independent and sovereign Congo. Now, Lumumba was no Marxist. Like most African nationalists, he favoured neither East nor West, instead preferring an unaligned foreign policy. However, upon hearing these words, the Belgian king was furious, and the impression in Belgium was that Lumumba wanted to institute an anti-white government. Meanwhile, in America, talk of social justice and economic independence got them thinking that Lumumba was a communist. From this point, it was clear that Lumumba was on a collision course with Western neo-colonial interests. Nationalism is, in short, a bloody complicated topic. Even though nationalism has had a massive effect on all of us for the past 300 years, the vast majority of us would struggle to define what it really means and what its origins are, and even those who have made careers studying it have come to wildly different conclusions. To do it justice, this topic would probably require another hour-long video, so for the sake of time, I'll try and provide the SparkNotes version. Before colonisation, the African continent was split between a variety of different polities and ethnic groups, some encompassing millions of people in well-developed and centralised political systems, and others representing small and spread-out peoples. These polities and ethnic groups had their own cultural and political traditions, some similar to those in Europe and some different, and these groups could often be very fluid, with no essentialised notion of what ethnicity or nationhood was. When the colonial powers took control, however, they didn't care about the geography of these ethnicities. They drew lines on their maps back in Europe and only later discovered who lived where. This ended up creating some borders which enclosed groups who had been bitter enemies for hundreds of years, and others which split apart groups which had previously been united. When African states started gaining independence, they quickly agreed that these borders were there to stay, and this has been the root of various conflicts across the continent for the past century. Congo was no different. The borders drawn up by Belgium and the other European colonial powers encompassed a variety of different ethnic groups, and while Lumumba and other Evolués saw themselves as having a Congolese national identity, others still saw themselves as holding pre-colonial ethnic and national identities, such as Bakongo or Lunda. This manifested in the May 1960 elections held just before independence to create the first Congolese parliament. Of the 137 seats contested, no party managed to gain seats across the country. Lumumba's MNC came closest. The party and its allies won 41 seats, including at least one seat in every provincial assembly, but their support base was primarily in the Oriental and Kasai provinces in the north and centre of the country. The Parti Solidaire Africain, PSA, another non-ethnic party friendly to Lumumba's MNC and headed by Antoine Gizenga, primarily got their support from smaller groups, gaining 13 seats. Abako, the Bakongo party headed by Joseph Kasavubu, won 12 seats in their western heartlands. Konakat, the party of different Katangan ethnicities led by Moise Chombe, won 8 seats in their southern strongholds. Out of this election was created a flimsy coalition involving the MNC, PSA and Abako, with Lumumba becoming Prime Minister and Abako's Kasavubu becoming President. But this was purely a coalition of convenience rather than one born of mutual political ideology. While Lumumba's Pan-Africanist views pushed him to consider joining Nkrumah's Ghana-Guinea Union, Kasavubu was flirting with breaking away from the Congo entirely and forming a Bakongo nation with Congo-Brazzaville. So, at independence, what we can see is a country heavily divided between those who viewed themselves as Congolese and those who did not. And this created the perfect storm. In one hand, European and American politicians and capitalists wanted to maintain the economic status quo in the Congo. While they could stomach political independence within reason, economic independence, especially the sort Lumumba advocated, was completely out of the question. In the other hand, there were a large number of political figures in the Congo who were completely uninterested in promoting a unified Congolese identity, instead willing to side with the economic status quo and Western politicians and capitalists if it allowed them to promote their regional and ethnic identities over a national identity. At the point of independence, internal tensions within the Congo were massive, and as we'll see, that spelt disaster. On the 5th of July 1960, 5 days after the Congo became independent, General Emile Janssens of the Force Publique organised a meeting with his NCOs. There had been increased pressure from below for the Congolese military to become Africanised and start introducing black commissioned officers, something Janssens staunchly refused. After giving a speech about loyalty and obedience to his NCOs, he walked up to the blackboard and wrote down 4 words. Before independence equals after independence. The effects were incendiary. In protest at this continued European domination, the soldiers mutinied, or, as Lumumba put it, went on strike, sacking the canteen and seizing the armoury. Over the following days, the mutiny spread to other barracks, with soldiers attacking European nationals and looting their properties, with many Europeans fleeing the country. This was the beginning of the Congo crisis. To try and quell tensions, Lumumba held a meeting with key government officials to rapidly Africanise the army, with the first decision being who would head this new military. 2 candidates were debated. The first was Maurice Mpolo, who was initially favoured due to the respect African soldiers held him in. However, Kasavubu and other Bakongo ministers feared Mpolo would enact a coup d'etat against the government. Instead, the second candidate was chosen, a figure seen as calmer and more thoughtful, and a former personal aide and friend of Lumumba. His name was Joseph Désiré Mobutu. This decision, and the promise to increase wages by 30%, helped ease tensions with the soldiers. However, the Belgian government still made an offer, more a demand, to send Belgian soldiers in and return law and order to the country. On the surface, this was to protect European civilians who continued to flee the country, but in reality the Belgian government was almost certainly influenced by the fear that black workers in the country's public sector, mines and factories would follow the example of the soldiers and go on strike for better wages too. UN officials in Leopoldville, for example, were reporting that workers were doing just that. Lumumba opposed Belgian intervention, but, with Belgian paratroopers already landing in the country, Kasavubu went against Lumumba's wishes and authorised it anyway. When the Belgian Navy bombarded the port of Matadi on the 11th of July, that only inflamed tensions more. But the real spark was in the southern region of Katanga. Konakat, under the leadership of Moise Tshombe, were pretty bad. Despite ostensibly representing different ethnic groups in the south of the country, in reality Konakat were the representatives of European settlers and mining groups, all of whom staunchly opposed Congolese independence and Lumumba's nationalist mission. In the introduction to Konakat's 1959 manifesto, for example, Bishop of Katanga Jean-Félix de Hemptigny wrote that a sector of humanity has inherited no civilization, no energy, no ideas, no interest to defend. The black race has nothing behind it. It is a people without writing, without history, without philosophy, without any consistency. And yes, just to clarify, this was in their election manifesto in a black majority country in 1959. And if his ghoulish appearance wasn't bad enough, there was a local legend that suggested he was either the illegitimate son or reincarnation of Leopold II himself. So, not a very pleasant fella all round. While the people of Katanga weren't particularly interested in secession, the party had already discussed it with Belgian settler groups and a hardcore of Belgian officers who opposed the Africanisation of the army. In the 1950s, Katanga's copper production made Congo the 4th largest copper producer in the world, and Katanga represented 75% of the world's cobalt production. With the growing crisis, they seized the opportunity. On the 11th of July, Tshombe proclaimed Katangan independence, denouncing Lumumba's communistic and dictatorial rule. Almost instantly, Western governments sided with the breakaway government. Belgium sent troops to the region, ostensibly for peacekeeping but in reality to prop up the new government and disarm any Congolese soldiers in the region who supported a nationalist rather than regionalist ideology. The Belgian government ordered its civil servants to stop cooperating with Lumumba and start working with Tshombe. Belgian, British, American, South African and Rhodesian companies all started backing the new state, with the Belgian UMHK instantly paying Tshombe 1.25 billion francs and advancing taxes that should have gone to Lumumba's central government. And with this mineral-rich region seceding, the Congo, in an instant, lost half its annual revenue. Katanga was, for all intents and purposes, a Belgian neo-colonial puppet state. With the situation deteriorating, Lumumba went to the United Nations, and with both the US and Soviets supporting a neutral solution to the crisis, an intervention was agreed. On the 15th of July, the first of what would become a 20,000-strong peacekeeping force, 80% of whom came from Asian and African countries like India, Malaysia, Ethiopia and Ghana, began to enter the country. Soon, however, it became clear this peacekeeping force would change little. In 1960, the UN was an American-dominated institution. Americans held key positions in its hierarchy in both New York and the Congo, and Americans dominated the UN's civilian operations and controlled communications between the Congo and the outside world. And with there being so few independent African countries, votes were dominated by American allies in Europe and Latin America. And this meant that the United Nations in the Congo generally represented Western interests. While Lumumba had hoped these forces would help unite the Congo and get Belgian troops out, in reality, General Secretary Dag Hammarskjöld insisted that the conflict was purely an internal affair and focused efforts on protecting European property. Belgian troops were allowed to stay in Katanga propping up the new government, and UN officials made it clear they would prevent the Congolese army and their allies from retaking control in the breakaway region. On the 9th of August, a second region, the diamond-rich province of South Kasai, proclaimed independence too. It seemed as if the UN intervention was little different to the Belgian intervention before it, enabling the further fracturing of the country for neo-colonial interests. With few alternative avenues left, Lumumba took more drastic actions. On the 15th of December 1960, Lumumba officially requested Soviet aid in reuniting the country and quelling the rebellions in Katanga and South Kasai. In reality, Soviet aid was extremely minor, limited to trucks, transport planes and technicians which were initially coming via the UN anyway. But to the United States and Belgium, this was official confirmation that Lumumba was the communist they always feared he was, and justified their belief that he needed to be ousted by any means necessary. On the 5th of December, the Belgian and American governments encouraged Kasavubu to fire Lumumba and establish a new government. To help him, American diplomat Andrew Cordier, who headed the UN operation in the Congo, ordered the national radio station in Leopoldville airport to close in an attempt to prevent Lumumbists from organising. This failed, however, with Parliament rejecting the constitutional basis of Kasavubu's decision and instead voting to remove him. With the parliamentary route to ousting Lumumba closed off, the Western powers next went to the military. On the 14th of September, Chief of Staff Joseph Désiré Mobutu staged a coup d'etat against Lumumba's government, stating that it was necessary for the army to temporarily step in to return law and order to the country. Mobutu was, in effect, on the payroll of Western governments. A mutiny against him by lower-ranking officers had been prevented days before after the UN used American funds to pay his troops. The Belgian government assured him that they created a 500 million franc fund to support a new government led by him on one condition: the effective neutralisation of Patrice Lumumba. This was a common theme in modern African history. With the rapid Africanisation of armies following independence, a lot of ambitious men with desires for power found themselves in high-ranking positions, and with opportunities for aid from both East and West, many of them seized the opportunity to coup. While Kasavubu was still technically the head of the country, in reality power lay with Mobutu. Lumumba was, effectively, put under house arrest. For now, Lumumba was in a fairly safe position. Although he was under house arrest and the Belgian and American governments were effectively plotting against him, he was guarded by African and Asian soldiers who were overwhelmingly supportive of his government. Lumumba, in a way, was a Nelson Mandela of his day, and commanded great respect across the former colonial world. Mobutu, having to keep up the auspices of civilian government still retaining power, allowed Lumumba to participate in talks to form a new government with Kasavubu and other parliamentarians. Although Mobutu attempted to wreck these talks by having Lumumba rearrested and taken away to a military camp at the end of September, Ghanaian UN peacekeepers loyal to Lumumba rebuffed him. On the 7th of October, Lumumba announced the formation of a new unity government. The UN, however, refused to support this, instead recognising Kasavubu's, and by extension Mobutu's, new delegates to the General Assembly. At this point it was clear that the UN was never going to allow Lumumba back into government, and this left him with only one choice. On the 27th of November 1960, at 8 p.m, a Chevrolet drove through the cordon of soldiers around Lumumba's residence. This was a regular occurrence and, with the pouring rain, the soldiers didn't care to search his car. Hidden in the footwell was Patrice Lumumba. With the UN refusing to recognise his legitimate government, he decided to flee on a 2,000-kilometre journey to Stanleyville, a hotbed of Lumumba's support where Deputy Prime Minister Antoine Gizenga, his close ally, was trying to establish a new government. Switching cars, he set off on the journey with his wife, son and a small number of political allies. As soon as the UN and Belgian governments realised, they jumped into action, using planes to scout the roads to try and locate Lumumba. They were convinced that if Lumumba made it to Stanleyville, he'd be too powerful for them to stop. Lumumba's column, however, ran into some hitches. Torrential rain and roadblocks slowed the way, and whenever Lumumba entered a new town he was mobbed by supporters who urged him to do a speech, something which the man couldn't refuse. On the 1st of December, at around midnight, Lumumba's convoy reached Lodi, a town on the bank of the river Sankuru. The river, some 600 metres wide, presented a serious challenge to the travellers. However, on the other side they'd be homeward bound, moving through strongly pro-Lumumba territories with good roads on the final leg to Stanleyville. Taking a small boat, Lumumba and his political advisers went first, with his wife and son waiting on the bank. Lumumba returned to collect his family. When he arrived, Mobutu's soldiers were waiting. Lumumba was quickly taken prisoner and transported back to Leopoldville. While the UN had offered protections to politicians like Kasavubu wherever they went, they refused to offer the same protections to Lumumba. While some UN soldiers tried to rebel against the officers to rescue him, such as a group of Ghanaian soldiers on the 2nd of December, they weren't fast enough. Before long, Lumumba was in Camp Hardy military base in Thysville, now called Mbanza and Gungu. His conditions were appalling. He was kept in a damp cell with no furniture and treated to regular beatings. In a letter to his wife, smuggled out of his prison, Lumumba conveyed his dire situation. He doubted whether his letters would ever reach her, or whether I shall be alive when you read them. He lamented that the Belgian colonists and their Western allies, with support from some highly placed officials in the United Nations and some of our compatriots, have trampled upon the Congo's independence. Yet Lumumba stayed defiant. He resolutely stated that, without dignity there is no freedom, without justice there is no dignity, and without independence there are no free men. Cruelty, insults and torture can never force me to ask for mercy, because I prefer to die with head held high, with indestructible faith and profound belief in the destiny of our country, than to live in humility and renounce the principles which are sacred to me. The day will come when history will speak, but it will not be the history which will be taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington or the United Nations. It will be the history which will be taught in the countries which have won freedom from colonialism and its puppets. Africa will write its own history, and in both North and South it will be a history of glory and dignity. Do not weep for me. I know that my tormented country will be able to defend its freedoms and its independence. Long live the Congo, long live Africa. Even in his prison cell, Mobutu and the Western governments were still afraid of Lumumba. There were increased reports of Congolese soldiers discussing Lumumba's treatment, and more of them were siding with the Prime Minister and wanting to see him set free. On the 27th of December, Colonel Bobozo had to spend the night, pistol drawn, standing outside Lumumba's cell to scare away the few dozen soldiers who had come out of their barracks to free him. On the 12th of January, even more soldiers mutinied, demanding better pay, a new government and the release of Lumumba. While some soldiers undoubtedly used proclaiming support for Lumumba as a way to get better pay, it's clear that pro-Lumumba sentiment was growing within the military, and that it was only a matter of time before some of them sprung in from his impromptu prison. Drastic measures would have to be taken to prevent this. For months, the Belgian government had been discussing the elimination definitive of Patrice Lumumba, and the American, British and French governments were all on board with this plan. In a meeting between President Eisenhower and the British Foreign Secretary Lord Home in September 1960, for example, both men agreed that it would be best if Lumumba were to fall into a river of crocodiles, with Lord Home regretting that we have lost many of the techniques of old-fashioned diplomacy. Their carefully chosen words left little to the imagination. Belgium, with full knowledge and support of the Western Allies, organised Lumumba's transport to Moise Tshombe in Katanga, to a puppet government which had pledged to kill him. On the 17th of January, he was handed over. Over the entire day, Lumumba and his two compatriots, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Akito, were brutally beaten, including having pieces of wood inserted beneath their fingernails and toenails. These beatings were carried out by Katangese soldiers, Katangese ministers like Tshombe, and Belgian officers. While some UN officials watched Lumumba's transportation to the Congo, witnessing the beatings on the runway at the airport and almost certainly in the knowledge he'd be killed, they didn't report it to their superiors. Late that night, shivering in the cold, Lumumba and his compatriots were taken out to the swamp. One by one they were put up against a tree and shot. Only 200 days after his country became independent, the 35-year-old Patrice Lumumba was killed. Lumumba's execution plunged the Congo into a period of instability and turmoil. The state cycled through a variety of different presidents and governments, including Moise Tshombe for a time becoming Prime Minister of a reunified Congo. Rebellions across the country continued, most notably the Simba Rebellion, with Lumumba supporters rising up in the east of the country in 1964 and establishing a People's Republic in Stanleyville. Although this new government received limited aid from the Eastern Bloc, including Che Guevara travelling with 100 Afro-Cuban supporters to provide training and advice, it quickly fell apart following a counter-offensive by Western mercenaries. When Moise Tshombe attempted to replace Kasavubu as president in 1965, Mobutu stepped into the political sphere again. While he had de facto led the country ever since 1960, he decided to make it official, doing away with Parliament and granting himself absolute powers. Mobutu's government increasingly took on the form of a personality cult. with Mobutuism becoming the main state ideology. The people of the Congo were forced to renounce their Christian names, with Joseph Désiré Mobutu becoming Mobutu Sese Seko, and a major emphasis was placed on tradition. As the Congo represented a variety of different cultural traditions, however, Mobutuist tradition was largely manufactured. This included the new name for the country, Zaire, which has a number of vague potential origins. And Mobutuism was not just a political ideology, it was religious too, with state agents likening Mobutu to Christ and his political party to the church. Unsurprisingly, this personalist system led to massive amounts of corruption and national decline. Mobutu treated the national bank as his personal bank account, using state resources to enrich himself, his family and his friends. It's estimated that he managed to stash away some $5 billion in state funds, making him one of the richest men in the world despite ruling one of the poorest countries. State agents feared telling Mobutu about unsuccessful government policies, and he'd often undermine them anyway out of the fear that, say, a successful military policy would empower another soldier to topple him. State workers would go unpaid, with soldiers essentially becoming bandits, preying on the local people to get resources for themselves. As the national economy shrank and inflation grew, Mobutu's power was increasingly confined to the capital and cities with military garrisons. And of course, this entire time Mobutu maintained the full support of his Western allies, including using French and Belgian paratroopers to put down rebellions in Katanga in the late 1970s. Mobutu's creditors continually rescheduled his debts. A failed state could be tolerated as long as they backed America over the Soviets. It wasn't until 1997 that Mobutu was ousted from power, and by then the damage was well and truly done. The Congo, a country of massive mineral and geographic wealth, a country with enough farmland to feed the African continent and enough hydroelectric power to power it, had the third to fourth lowest GDP per capita in the world, with 80% of the people living in extreme poverty on less than $1.25 per day. And nobody was ever punished for these crimes. The Belgian and American officials involved went on to have successful careers afterwards, never facing any repercussions and blaming Lumumba's death on a bunch of drunken out-of-control Katangans. Perhaps the most galling example is Gerard Soweto, the Belgian police commissioner in Katanga who got rid of Lumumba's body. In 1999, not only was he still walking free, but he revealed to journalists that he was still in possession of 2 of Lumumba's teeth and the bullet that killed him. Not content with helping assassinate a democratically elected leader who dared to insist that the Congolese and African people should have independence and sovereignty, he took home a trophy to celebrate. This story has become a familiar one in Africa. In states across the continent, from Nkrumah's Ghana to Thomas Sankara's Burkina Faso to Patrice Lumumba's Congo, political leaders who sought to challenge neo-colonial domination have been ousted or killed in mutinies and coups. Rarely has it been quite as blatant as what happened in the Congo, but all these military interventions involve similar themes. They all, fundamentally, stemmed from the underdevelopment of Africa which occurred under colonialism. This underdevelopment created post-colonial states which were still economically controlled by foreign companies, economically dependent on foreign countries, and driven by social and ethnic divisions often stoked during the colonial era. This gave ambitious men who cared little for the well-being of their compatriots ample opportunities to seize power through undemocratic means. While these soldiers were rarely explicitly told to pull the trigger, they always did so in the full knowledge that they received bountiful support from the Western or Eastern powers afterwards, regardless of how well they actually governed. The emphasis was placed on keeping them in Western or Eastern political spheres, not on giving these countries the tools to attain genuine independence. And any opposition to these authoritarian neo-colonial governments will be brutally suppressed. So when you hear someone complain that Africans have not done enough since independence to develop their countries and promote democracy and liberty, remember that many who attempted to do so, such as Patrice Lumumba, were killed by the former colonial powers for their efforts. Thanks for watching. So yeah, thanks for watching. That's the second video on my channel now. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them and I'll try and answer them either in the comments or if there's enough, I might make another video about it. Originally this was going to be the first video, but the section on Leopold's Congo sort of span out of control a bit, so I decided to split that off into its own video, and I think that's worked out quite nicely. I'm going to be doing other videos about post-colonial African history in the near future. At the moment I'm thinking of doing a video about either the role of Cuba in the end of apartheid or about French neo-colonialism and the French Union. So let me know if either of those take your interest, or if there's any other topics relating to that you'd like me to cover. But yeah, thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe and all that shit.